right, well, we'll go ahead and get started this morning. So, welcome and good morning. I thank you all for being here. As I said, after an intense day of college football, you get bonus points for being here this morning. I love college football, absolutely love football season. However, it does just wreck me on Sundays because if your team plays the late game, you just have to stay up and watch it. And so it's like an 11 p.m. bedtime for me every Saturday. So we'll see how we do this morning, I guess is what I'm saying. We'll see. But I appreciate y'all being here. So we're going to continue with our study, Stained Glass People. We've been looking at the lives of the saints. As always, we're going to begin with kind of a little bit of a review. But today, we're going to move into another period of history. So last week we talked about the time of Constantine and a little bit after that. So right around the time that Christianity becomes legalized in the Roman Empire. And today we're going to move into the mostly saints that are focused on the British Isles and really form what I think of as the genesis of medieval Christianity. So we're not really in the Middle Ages yet, but everybody we talk about today, especially people like Benedict, Saint Benedict, become hugely influential over the next, really many centuries. And so we're starting to get into some folks that actually also have very familiar names, though I tried to pepper in a couple in this that are a little less familiar to give some variety. The reason also this says session 5 and then in parentheses and 6 is that I really didn't know a good way of breaking this one up, and there's no way that we're going to get to the end of today's presentation. And if we do, it's because I've talked extraordinarily quickly and it will not be good. There's no way we can really make it through today's presentation, so we'll pick up where we left off next week. So this will be a little bit of 2 weeks worth of saints here in this one presentation, but they really all kind of go together, not just chronologically, but also in terms of, like I said, geographically and things like that. So that's today. That's what we're going to talk about. But before we do that, we got to go back to reminding ourselves what we talk about when we talk about the saints, because talking about the saints is a little bit challenging. Now, this is familiar. Really looking around this room, all of you have been to more than one of these, so we've looked at this before. But we talk about saints as stained glass people, as the title of the class indicates, because saints are people not just that we maybe venerate or look to as an example of emulation, an example of what it might look like to live a holy life, but also someone whose life shows forth the glory of God. God's glory kind of shines through their life in some particular way. Now, we've been very careful to note in each of these sessions that does not mean that we are looking at doing a study of perfect people. Far from it, right? There is no such thing outside of Jesus Christ, okay? And so, but actually many of the saints are saints precisely because they are so imperfect, right? And actually have profound engagement, therefore, with God's grace and mercy. And that shows us something very valuable about what it looks like to lead a holy life. And we see that from the very beginning. In week 2, remember, we talked about biblical saints that we find in the pages of Scripture, people like Peter, Paul, the apostles, all of those folks. And there is no better example of imperfect people than those. Paul in particular, right? We talked about how Paul was a persecutor of the early church. And even in the book of Acts gives that what I find to be just this really haunting detail about the stoning of St. Stephen. So we talked about Stephen as well, who is widely regarded as one of the first Christian martyrs, often is referred to as the first Christian martyr, but we talked about how that was a little complicated because there's also the Holy Innocents who were Herod had murdered in Bethlehem. Anyway, but nevertheless, Stephen gets the title usually as the first martyr. And there's this detail in the book of Acts when it talks about the folks who came to stone Stephen, how those people threw their cloaks at the foot of this man to be able to throw their stones harder. And the person who was standing there was Paul, right? And that detail to me is just so haunting and so profound that then Paul goes on from that point actually to become the Paul that we know, right? By far not a perfect person, but certainly someone to look to as an example of the ways that God's grace can change and transform our lives, right? And so this is kind of how we've been looking at saints, is that saints are both every baptized Christian. We're all a member of the communion of saints as a baptized Christian, but also how there are particular people that we look to as examples both of holiness and spiritual growth, but also of the profound power of God's grace. And we've also talked, too, about how we also know some of these people, that there are people in our own lives that we look to as examples of holiness, or maybe look to as examples that illustrate the profound nature of God's grace to act in our lives. We've also been talking about this quote a great deal. It comes from the philosopher William James, who I don't know if I mentioned this before, but William James is the brother of the noted American novelist Henry James. I don't know if you had to, I don't want to say suffer through, because many people regard Henry James as like one of the great, classic writers, but I sort of suffered through some Henry James as an English major. But his brother, William, was a philosopher and wrote on religious experience. And he has this quote about saints that we've been talking about, because I think it does a great job of capturing the complexity and the different ways that saints operate in our lives of faith, how they operate as examples for us. He talks about saints as being authors or increasers of goodness in the world. And he gets at this notion that's found in Paul's letters that talks about any baptized Christian being a member of the communion of saints. So he talks about the ordinariness, on the one hand, of saints, but also how saints that we look to as examples are torchbearers of our belief. They are the tip of the wedge, the cleavers of the darkness in the world. And he uses this image of a wave cresting, like the single drops which sparkle in the sun as they're flung far ahead of the advancing edge of a wave or a flood. Saints show the way for us. They're forerunners. They're basically spiritual innovators that help us see new ways of living and being in Christ. Is sort of how William James conceives of them. And so anyway, I've gone back to this quote a great deal because I think, one, it's a beautiful quote. It's clear that rich imagery and good writing kind of ran in the family. But also, I think it does a good job, like I said, of bringing to light the various facets of saints and their examples for us in our lives of faith. And the quote ends by saying that one fire kindles another. Without that overtrust in human worth which saints show us, the rest of us would lie in spiritual stagnancy. So the quote ends with this thing that I think actually the saints do really well, which is the saints' lives inspire us, right? They inspire us to live our lives differently, right? That's part of what they do. One fire lights another. And so we've already seen that in a profound way in the lives of the saints that we've studied, because like last week, for instance, a number of those saints actually interacted with one another. And we talked, for instance, about those two saints' mamas last week. There are two, Helena and Monica. Helena was the mom of Constantine, and Monica was the mom of St. Augustine. And both of them, we talked about how the moms were actually much better Christians. They were actually the pious, devoted ones, and their sons, though, end up being much more famous. But Constantine, obviously, jokingly, he's no saint, ha 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 ha, right? He was an emperor. He was a warrior. He went and slaughtered many thousands of people. But his mom was the pious, devoted Christian who was an influence on her son. And similarly, Augustine, right, was wayward. I've quoted that famous line, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." You know, I mean, that was Augustine. He was happy to maybe be holy, but later, right? He needed to get his debauchery out of the way first. Before that, and his mom, Monica, was the pious, holy one who, it is said, wept every night for her son's conversion, which is why last week she's often depicted with tears running down her cheeks on behalf of her son. And so we see how one flame kindles another, right? How these wives and witnesses do ripple out and inspire belief in others. To say nothing of Augustine himself, who was discipled and then converted and baptized by St. Ambrose, who we talked about last week as well. So anyway, so I love this quote from William James because I think it ties together all of these different threads that we talk about when we look at the lives of the saints. And so that is our introduction for today. Let's get into actually talking about some saints. So the period of history that we're talking about now is the 5th and 6th centuries, which of course means we're talking about the 400s and the 500s, because of course when you talk about the whatever century, it's always not the number you're referring to, which is very confusing. Okay, so we're talking about the 400s and 500s. And we're going to start today with St. Jerome. St. Jerome. There we go. So here are St. Jerome's details. He was born around 345. As with most of these saints, birth dates are really murky. Death dates tend to be more well-known because by the time that they die, these figures become important in the life of the church. So people know the day that they died, which becomes more important anyway because that's the day of your heavenly birth, right? So a saint's feast day is never celebrated on their birthday. It's always celebrated on the day that they died because that's the important date. So we don't really know when Jerome was born, somewhere around 345, but he died on the 30th of September, 420, which incidentally, September 30th is my birthday. So St. Jerome, I guess, technically is my patron dude because he died on my birthday. But Jerome, you might remember, is from history class, is very important because he translates the Bible into Latin, okay, with what we call the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate Bible. And for his scholarly pursuits, he is the patron saint of archaeologists, biblical scholars, translators, and librarians, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about Jerome, though, in his life. So, before he was known as St. Jerome, he was actually named Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus. Okay? Yeah, that's right. Say that 5 times fast. I can't even say it 1 time slowly, so I don't know. So St. Jerome is much easier to say. Like I said, he was born somewhere in the 340s in Dalmatia. And today, that would have been somewhere in Croatia or Slovenia. Okay, so that's kind of where Jerome was from. He was educated as a young boy by a famous Roman grammarian. And so he was educated, like very well educated from an early age. Okay, he was formally educated, which is important because in those days you didn't have like standardized, you didn't have like a schoolhouse, right? People had to be educated by tutors, which often meant that if you were educated, you were wealthy, most likely. Very little else is known of his childhood other than his parents' life that I read said, quote, despite their efforts, his parents' efforts to raise Jerome properly, the young man behaved as he chose. Okay, so once again, a kind of wayward son here. Around the age of 12 or so, he travels to Rome to study grammar, philosophy, and rhetoric. Those were the most kind of important time academically. And it's likely because of what he studied, probably considered a career in law. And by his own admission, it says, this bio that I found, it says he quickly forgot his morals. So he was already wayward and then forgets his morals. So I don't know what Jerome was up to, but he was living it up at school, I guess. And while he was not studying, it said Jerome pursued pleasure. In particular, he pursued women, even though that he knew that his behavior was wrong. All right, so Jerome was a bit of a ladies' man. Man, this whole thing, Augustine and Jerome both, they were both in this make me chaste but not yet place, I guess. But he often felt, but again, he knew that what he was doing was not moral, and so he did have enough of a conscience to feel very bad about it. And so to alleviate his guilt, now this is an interesting way of dealing with your guilt. To alleviate the guilt that he often felt, he would go and visit the crypts in Rome. He would go to the catacombs, and he would imagine himself in hell. That's what he would go and do when he felt really bad, okay? It was a pretty intense way to deal with your guilt. And he would do this regularly. He'd do this every Sunday, even though at this point he wasn't really himself a professed Christian, but he would go to the catacombs and he would feel like he would imagine himself in hell to like feel bad about the sins that he'd committed. And again, the bio that I read said, he succeeded in frightening himself, but not in changing his ways. So apparently this, this did not, at least initially, lead to any amended behavior. But, and again, a flame gives birth to another flame. He had a companion, a guy named Bonosus, who was himself a Christian. And he was a big influence on his friend Jerome. And his influence was actually part of what persuaded Jerome to become a Christian and change his ways for the better. So even though going into the catacombs and trying to scare himself, into hell or out of hell, I guess, it didn't work until actually a friend of his sort of spoke into his life and by example sort of led Jerome to a different way of living. And so in or around the year 366, again, we don't quite know, but somewhere around in there, Jerome decides to become a Christian and is actually baptized by the Pope, Pope Liberius in Rome. Okay. So now that he's a Christian, Jerome, because he's a very academic guy, right? He's a very scholarly guy. He becomes very interested in theological matters, and he sets aside all of his theological study, sets aside all of his secular to devote himself to theological study. And so he travels with his friend Bonosus to a place called Trier, which is in Germany, where there were schools for him to gain ecclesiastical training. Okay, so he basically sends himself off to seminary. He ends up in a monastery at one point that had attracted a lot of the greatest minds of the time. They were all kind of hanging out around this monastery, and so it's while he's there that he meets a guy named Rufinus, I don't know, depends on how classical Latin you want to be. It'd be Rufinus if you really wanted to go for it, but that sounds funny, so we're going to call him R. And Jerome and R become friends. Anyway, this monk that he meets, R, is known for his translation of Greek and Latin texts, which is what starts to kind of get Jerome interested in that as well. And what he would do, actually, while he was in the Roman catacombs, was, while he wasn't just scaring himself, he would also spend time translating the inscriptions in the catacombs. And so he had this sort of amateur fascination with translation. But then this sort of formalizes that for him. And eventually, he translates the scriptures. But we're not quite there. He continues to travel with his friend Bonosus, and they have a falling out and decide to part ways. Bonosus goes to an island in the Adriatic Sea where he lives for a hermit, and Jerome travels east. He's bound for Antioch by way of Athens. And in 374, Jerome finally reaches Antioch after making a bunch of stops along the way, and it is while there that he begins some of his more famous works. Okay, he becomes ill. He gets some disease. It's unclear what he has, but it actually ends up taking the lives of a number of his friends. So he sort of endures this personal hardship during this time. And during this time, maybe because of disease, whatever it was, Jerome has this series of visions, okay, while he's very ill, these sort of fever dream-like things. And these actually increase his devotion. They're these sort of religious visions, and so they make him even more religious. And it's at this point, motivated by these visions that he has while he's sick, that he goes out into the desert to live for 4 years, and he lives as a hermit. Now this, I mentioned this in particular, not just because, it's also because this becomes an increasing practice in the life of the church. We're going to look at another guy here in a second who doesn't go out into exile in the middle of nowhere, but this idea of being in the desert someplace and depriving yourself by doing certain ascetical practices becomes very increasingly common in the life of the church as a means of holiness. Okay, so Jerome has this own desert journey for 4 years, and he emerges from his hermitage and becomes, it says, quickly embroiled in conflict with the church in Antioch. Okay, he didn't want to become a priest. He wanted to become a monk or a hermit, but church officials in Antioch, as well as the Pope himself, actually want Jerome to be ordained. And finally, Jerome relents on the condition that he would not be expected to serve in any ministry. That's it. So he's like, I'll get ordained, but I'm not doing any of the work, okay? And somehow they say, all right, that's fine. So they ordain him, and he pursues monastic life. Okay? So he travels to Constantinople, where he studies under a very important person, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, who is renowned as a theologian, actually is one of the church fathers, is kind of a big deal. So he studies with him for a while, then he travels back to Rome for a church council and meets the Pope, and a different Pope than the one that baptized him. And while he's there, the Pope makes Jerome his personal secretary, okay, because he's not going to do ministry work, so he becomes an administrator, I guess. So while he is the secretary to the Pope, he promotes this ideal of asceticism to everybody around him, including a group of women in the city who wanted to live saintly lives themselves. It is said that he was a sarcastic man of great wit, which makes him pretty unpopular, actually, with people, because he offends a number of people. The Pope would shield Jerome from criticism, but once the Pope dies, Jerome doesn't have that barrier anymore, and so Jerome comes under fire from a lot of these enemies that he's made along the way. Let's see. So he goes to the Holy Land. I mean, the point of this is that Jerome travels a lot. So he has to leave Rome because he makes all of these enemies. He goes to the Holy Land, comes back to Antioch. Well, he goes to Egypt, okay? He was easily upset, and a bunch of the leading scholars of the day, they sort of exchange words with Jerome. Not just does Jerome learn from them, but people like Augustine actually have some barbed critiques of Jerome in his day. They exchange letters, and eventually, actually, they do repair their relationship, and they were able to correspond as friends and colleagues, but they were at odds with one another for a while. Now, of all the things, as I said, that Jerome is famous for, the thing that makes him most famous is his translation of the Bible. This was a really big deal. He did that translation work while he was still in Rome, working as the Pope's secretary, so that's when he undertakes this biblical translation work. And he spends his entire life working on this, translating the Scriptures. Now, what's really notable about his translation of the Old Testament in particular is that instead of using the Greek Septuagint, so there were kind of two main versions of the Old Testament. There's something called the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Old Testament. And then there is, of course, the writings as they exist in Hebrew. And Jerome actually used the Hebrew texts to translate into Latin rather than translating from the Greek. And so that's, I think, a very interesting thing because obviously, the Old Testament was not written in Greek initially. You know what I mean? The prophets, Moses, the Israelites didn't speak. Well, they may have spoken a little bit of Greek, actually, but it's more kind of getting into the language of the faith itself. And so he translates the Old Testament from the Hebrew and not from the Greek, which I think is fascinating. Again, he dies on September 30th, 420, and he dies peacefully, and he was laid to rest under the Church of the Nativity, but then his remains were later transferred to Rome. Okay. And as I said, he's the patron saint of archaeologists, biblical scholars, librarians, students, and translators, and his feast day is still celebrated on September 30th, as would be fitting. Now, Jerome is one of these examples of, we've talked about how different saints kind of are revered for different reasons, right? We've got saints who are revered because they were martyred, right? They died for their faith. We have saints who are revered because they performed these miraculous acts. And then we also have saints who are revered for their intellect and their intellectual contribution to the life of the church. Maybe it was for their theological writings. Maybe it was for the part that they played in certain church councils or for their sermons or all of the above, right? And in this case, Jerome is really revered for his academic work, and in particular this which is very important and foundational because, again, still at this point, you didn't have too many Bibles as we would know them. I mean, Bibles are so ubiquitous today that we forget that actually Bibles would have been immensely precious at this time, because there was no such thing as the printing press. There was no such thing as an easy way to have a large book. And so Bibles had to be translated by hand and then inscribed by hand. They were very precious objects. And so to have an entire Bible in the language at that time that would have been the language of the people, the vulgar tongue, hence Vulgate, right? Latin we think of as being a high-minded thing, but at that time that would have been the common language spoken around the empire still. So that was a really big undertaking. And so there's Jerome, noted for his biblical scholarship and also for the ways that he seems to have irritated people. We remember Jerome. So there's, so there, I didn't put this in there, and I don't want to go too in depth on this, but there's a part there's a part in the story of Moses where, Moses goes up on the mountain to get the law, and he experiences God's glory there, there was something literally lost in translation about the sort of like horns of light or something like that. Yeah, they were described in that way. And it gets mistranslated as Moses having literal horns on his head. And so in certain, there's even some stained glass windows to this day. You can go see from medieval churches that depict Moses having these like goat horns kind of on his head because it was mistranslated. With the horns, yes. Anyway, so if you ever see a man with tablets that look like the Ten Commandments and it has like weird animal horns, that's why. That's why the work of biblical translation is very important, folks, and very challenging. But it is, that's a really good example of something that we talked about last week too with St. Nicholas, right? Where if you were here last week, I told this legend that rises up around St. Nicholas about these pickled babies. These children that the story goes, it was a famine in the land, and this evil butcher traps these children, and he kills these children, and he puts them in pickle brine. He's going to sell them as hams. This is the idea. And St. Nicholas just happens to be in town and comes through town, and he blesses this barrel of pickle brine, and the babies resurrect out of and this butcher's nefarious plot is revealed. And this is a very popular story in the Middle Ages, but then people forget it. But there's all these pictures of St. Nicholas blessing this barrel with these babies coming out of it. And so Nicholas becomes associated with children and brewers because people think, oh, well, there must have been beer in there. I don't know. Babies would be coming out of the beer. It doesn't make any sense. But similar to what happens with Moses and the horns, is it's like, oh, well, I guess Moses had horns, so we'll just put that in there, Mm-hmm.
So how does he go about translating?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So how does Jerome go about translating the Hebrew if Latin was the language of the day? One of the things about the ancient world that the ancient world was both hyper-localized but also a little bit more cosmopolitan than we give it credit for. I mean, obviously Jerome's traveling all over the place, right? Like he's hopping around. And so you would have people, I mean, even in Jesus' day, you would have had, even the disciples themselves would have spoken, their version of Hebrew that was localized to their communities, but also probably if they were fishermen, in order to do business in the market, they would have known some Greek, common Greek, Koine Greek. Almost everybody was a little bit multilingual, at least in some way. You wouldn't be literate, you probably couldn't read or write, because that was something that only, you had to go to school to do that. But in terms of speaking different languages, a lot of folks in the Near East in particular would have been multilingual to kind of. So that's a great question, though. All right, so that's Jerome. Let's talk about Julia of Corsica. Oopsie. Wowee. Wow. There we go. Now, I threw Julia in because most of the saints that we're going to talk about over the next 2 weeks are folks that we know. But I wanted to throw in somebody that we don't know, because I didn't know who Julia of Corsica was. But she's interesting, like most of these saints that we're about to get into, becomes the patron saint of a location. Okay, a lot of the saints that we're going to talk about start to become associated with a piece of geography, and they become the patron of this place. And Julia is the patron saint of Corsica. Okay, she was born, we have no idea when. Nobody knew. Every biography I looked at was like, shrug. We have no idea. So question mark on her birth date. And we don't really even know the exact date of her death in this case, but she died sometime after 439. And she has an interesting story. She's also known as St. Julia of Carthage. She was born into a noble family. She had aristocratic parents who were in Carthage, and Carthage was a place of great power and wealth at the time. But because of that, over time, Carthage is subject to all of these attacks from outside, weaken the city's defenses. Now, during one of these attacks by the king of the Vandals, actually, Julia is taken from her family and sold into slavery. Okay? She gets purchased by a pagan merchant from Syria named Eusebius. There's lots of Eusebiuses. There's a famous church historian named Eusebius. In fact, one of Jerome's names was Eusebius, I believe, if we remember. But anyway, so she's purchased by a named Eusebius. Even during the most daunting chores that she was made to do, Julia never complained or felt sorry for herself, it is said. Okay, she was known for being patient and cheerful. She was able to find comfort in her place in the world and passionately loved God, despite her circumstances. When she wasn't being forced to do hard labor, she devoted her time towards praying and reading books of piety, so she could read and was literate. Eusebius, charmed by Julia's commitment and devotion, felt that it was okay to bring her along with him on his journey back towards Gaul, basically where modern-day France is. And upon reaching the northern part of an island, then Corsica, he anchors his ship to join this pagan festival, okay, which Julia viewed as this idolatrous thing, right? So she's coming along this journey, but her master's doing all this stuff. So she was left alone while Eusebius is off doing whatever he's doing at the festival because she didn't want to be defiled by the superstitious ceremonies that that were going on there. And at this point, while the festival is going on, the governor of the island, a guy named Felix, notices Julia and felt that her lack of participation was an insult to the pagan gods. So Eusebius tells Felix that Julia is a Christian and that despite his authority over her, that she would not renounce her faith. Eusebius explains that he could not bear parting with Julia because she was so diligent and faithful in her work. But Felix would not accept this fact that she wouldn't convert. This is pagan faith. And so he offers 4 of his best female slaves in exchange for Julia, okay, to Eusebius. Eusebius replies, "No, all you are worth will not purchase her, for I would freely lose the valuable thing that I have in the world rather than be deprived of her." But Felix doesn't take no for an answer, and so he prepares a banquet. He waits until Eusebius becomes intoxicated and falls asleep, so he basically gets Eusebius absolutely drunk. And then he decides to make his move. He finds Julia alone. He tries to get her to make a sacrifice to his gods, tells her that he'll grant her freedom if she would just convert. But Julia refuses to deny Jesus. She says, "My freedom is to serve Christ, whom I love every day in all the purity of my soul." Obviously, Felix is not happy about this. He's still angry and enraged. He has her struck in the face. He has her hair torn from her head. She's tortured. And even still, she continues to confess her Christian faith. Now, finally, Felix has her hanged on a cross until she dies. So she dies similarly to Jesus. Her body is carried off by monks from the Isle of Gorgon. But in 763, the king of Lombardy had her relics moved. So her body is carried off and buried there at the monastery in Gorgon. But then she's moved into a region in North Italy where her memory is celebrated even now, it says, with great devotion. That was what the internet told me. I did not get a chance to look up what that means, but there she is still. She is often depicted with the palm of martyrdom, so a palm frond, thinking about Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, for instance. And the crucifix, which, again, not only symbolizes her solidarity with Jesus, but also the fact that she died in a similar manner. She's the patron saint of Corsica. She's the patron saint of torture victims and pathologies of the hands and feet, which I find really interesting for some reason. And her feast day is celebrated on May 23rd, even though we don't know her actual date of death, but that was the date that was sort of chosen for her commemoration. And so that is Julia, right? So even though Julia is born and lives after the legalization of Christianity across the empire, you can see in her life an example that it wasn't like this sort of fixed thing where Christianity suddenly became wonderful and great and everybody loved it and converted immediately or something like that, right? Like there was still very much a number of different religious traditions all going on around the Mediterranean, the Near East, some of those more hospitable to Christians than others. And Julia still finds herself running afoul of some of that, at least as the story goes. And so her example, she becomes the patron of this place, and anyway, and is still celebrated there. So that's St. Julia of Corsica. Now let's talk about Simeon the Stylite. I think Simeon is incredibly fascinating, okay, incredibly fascinating. Okay, so here is Simeon. Simeon is most famous for living his life up atop a pillar, which is what you see depicted in this cool thing over here, okay? He's on top of this pillar on this platform, kind of living his life in holiness. Now, he is said to have been born around the year 390 and died on the 2nd of September in 459. He was a Syrian Christian ascetic, and he achieved notability, as I said, by living 37 years. Okay, he lived for 37 years on a small platform on the top of a pillar outside of Aleppo. Okay, which is Aleppo in Syria. Yeah, Aleppo. Yeah. So he was near there. Several other people, okay, talking about fire lighting other flames. Other people actually end up following in his example. Interestingly, he inspires a little movement that follow him, and they're all referred to as stylites because the Greek word for pillar. That's the Greek word for pillar. Okay, so. But he was the first. He was the originator of this. Simeon is venerated as a saint by the Oriental Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Roman Catholic Church. He is known formally as Simeon the Stylite, the elder, okay, to distinguish him from the younger. Okay, it's not. But there are actually multiple Simeons that did this. There was Simeon the third, who was a Stylite, and Simeon Stylite of Lesbos. Okay, so there were, like, again, multiple people who thought, man, this is how you need to live holy life, is by sitting on top of a pillar for a long time. He was the son of a shepherd. He was born in what is now a town in Turkey. Empire in 395, this part of the world where he was from becomes part of the Eastern Roman Empire, right? So it cleaves into the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. So Rome becomes the center of the Western Roman Empire, and Constantinople, of course, of the East, in the Eastern Empire. Christianity took hold very quickly there, where he was from. According to the writer Theodoret, Simeon develops a zeal for Christianity in his adolescence, around the age of 13, following a time when he hears the reading of the Beatitudes, right? The Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, etc., etc. And while that is one of my favorite passages of Scripture, I'm not sure that in reading it I have ever been inspired. I don't know that it has had quite that effect on me. But now he didn't do that from the first. At the beginning, he gave himself up to these ascetic practices. Again, this becomes much more popular, right? This self-deprecating reliance on God and holiness. And he did these practices. They were so austere and so extreme, rather, that those around him judged him to be unsuited to any form of community life. Okay, they were like, you are so intense, you can't even come and live in the monastery. Like, that's how austere and ascetic you are, okay? So, where he passes through, it says, the entirety of Lent without eating or drinking anything, okay? Then he emerged. His achievement of not eating or drinking anything was hailed a miracle that he was able to deprive himself to this extent. And later on, this is, again, before he's even on top of the pillar, what he does is, as his spiritual practice, is he takes to standing continually upright as long as his limbs would sustain him. Like, just these weird feats of kind of, again, deprivation in the name of piety. Okay, so he lives in this hut for a year and a half, as I said, and then he goes to this rocky kind of crag next to a mountain, now part of Mount Simeon. He chooses to live in this little teeny narrow crevice. It's less than 20 meters in diameter, but he was beginning to become somewhat of a celebrity because of all these crazy things that he would do. And so crowds of pilgrims would come to seek him out, to ask for his counsel or for his prayers, for his wisdom. And he was irritated by this because it left him not enough time to do his devotions. Like all these things that he was doing, he was being bothered by all these people. And so this eventually, in order to get away from these people, he went to this pillar. Okay, this is his solution. Is there is this pillar which was in the midst of these ruins outside Aleppo. And he builds this little platform on the top of this pillar, and that's his solution, is I'm going to get away from the people by living on top of the pillar. So he goes to the pillar, and it's said that for sustenance, boys from the nearby village would climb up the pillar, and they would give him parcels of bread or goat's milk or things like that for him to eat. And it's also said that he may have pulled up food, like using a bucket. Like people would come and put food in a bucket, and he'd pull it up to eat. But he was living on this pillar. Now these monastics who were living out in the desert heard about this. They were they found this to be really curious. I mean, just like you or I would be like, wow, living on a pillar, that's a really interesting choice there, Simeon. So too, people in the ancient world were like, that's weird. Why are you doing that? And so they wanted to come and test him to determine whether what he was doing was actually coming from a place of humility or pride. Because they thought, wow, this is just so weird that it's showy, right? This is almost prideful. You're being so holy that it's maybe actually bad for your ego, right? So they come to test him. And so they go to him and they order Simeon to come down from the pillar. And they decide that if he doesn't obey them, they would forcibly drag him to the ground. But if he was willing to submit to their request, they would leave him up there, because that meant that he was humble enough to be willing to come down. That was the test. And so when they asked him to come down, Simeon obeys them. And the monks actually told him, well, okay, if you don't, that's fine. You can actually stay up there. We were just doing it to test you. We were just seeing if you would be willing to do it. So yeah, some test, I guess. But that's what they determined, that it was out of humility that he was doing this. So he's been on this pillar for a while, okay? It's not the only pillar that Simeon occupies throughout his life. No. In fact, they built him a bigger pillar, okay? So this first pillar was only about 10 feet high, okay, so not very tall. But then they get his platform and move him to a pillar that was reportedly 15 meters high, or roughly 50 feet up off the ground. Okay, so think about, that's he's way up there somehow, living on this little pillar, or this little platform on top of the pillar. It was believed or said, and again, we don't know how big the little platform was, but it was believed to have been about 1 square meter. So that's pretty small, you know what I mean? So it's like a little thing that he's living up on this 50-foot high pillar. It says that even on the highest of these columns, though, he was not withdrawn from the world. If anything, this new pillar attracted even more people because that's even weirder than living on a short pillar, right? Like, living on a short pillar was bizarre, but living on a super tall pillar is even weirder. So more people are like, oh man, we got to come and check out this guy who lives up on the, the pillar. Have you heard of this guy, Simeon? And so basically, all these pilgrims come and visit him, and he starts every afternoon talking from the top of this pillar with these visitors. And by means of this ladder, visitors were able to kind of climb up there to be close enough to him, like not up on the platform, obviously, but they'd get close enough to him and they would talk to him. He would write letters from his pillar and have them handed down. He would give lectures and addresses from this pillar on matters of holiness. People would come to him for advice and all that sort of stuff. So he's developing like kind of this interesting following, right? And reports of him finally reach the church hierarchy and the imperial court. Like word of him travels far enough to get there. And so it is said that Emperor Theodosius II actually greatly, and his wife too, greatly respected Simeon and listened to his counsels. So instead of being like, wow, this is super weird, even the emperor was like, I need to get wisdom from the guy on top of the pillar. That's where I'm going to go. He's clearly figured out something we haven't figured out, and we got to go talk to him. So anyway, so he becomes this really kind of big deal. And eventually, this double wall has to be built around the foot of the pillar because the crowds would just be so much that it was said they would disturb his prayerful meditation. And so they built this wall around so he could pray in peace. I mean, it's just really fascinating, right? And accounts differ regarding how long he actually lived up there. Some estimates say 35 years, some say 37, some say all the way up to 42 years he lived on top of a pillar. But it was, at any rate, kind of a long time, right? Like decades of his life he spent up there. And he dies on the 2nd of September, 459, and it's said that a disciple finds his body just sort of stooped over in prayer, and he just kind of passed away up there. So they bring his body down, and the Patriarch of Antioch performs his funeral before this huge crowd. Like this huge crowd of people shows up for Simeon's funeral, and he's buried not far from the pillar on which he lived for so long. And so, like I said, this inspires all of these other people to see this as a means of devotion, of literally, I guess, getting closer to God by living on top of a pillar, which is really, really fascinating. So that's Simeon the Stylite, which is where we'll end today because we're running out of time like I knew we would, and we'll get through some of the other saints next week, including some that I know you will know, like Patrick, okay, whose saint is celebrated every single March by lots of people who have nothing to do with Ireland whatsoever. But we all really love St. Patrick in March. But we will talk about him and some others, including St. Bridget, who I love. She's got some of the coolest legends out there. But we'll talk about them later. But anyway, so you see, I hope today, like, again, this weird mix, right, of people who seek to embody their faith in different ways, whose devotion leads them to do different things, from studying and translating Scripture in the case of Jerome, right? Like Jerome is noted for his intellect and his academic pursuit in relation to the faith. Then you have people like Julia who end up being martyred, like others that we have seen. They end up losing their life for their faith. And then you've got folks like Simeon who are just doing weird ascetical things, like depriving themselves of food and water, living on pillars, all in attempts to bring themselves closer in some way to God and to show their devotion to God. And so, just fascinating. Now, I don't know if, in this case today, I'll find out one of you is building a pillar out near the patch to go and sit on. I don't know, but I hope that something of these of the lives of these folks who we are inheritors of their witness, right, has inspired something in each of you today. So in our last couple of minutes together, are there any questions or comments or anything about any? That's right, yes. It does bring new meaning to being put on a pedestal, for sure. Yeah, yes, yes. You know, that is a great question if he is a patron of anything. I didn't find anything. It doesn't mean that he's not, but, I'd be interested to know, right? Like, he's definitely the patron of pillars. Like, you have to know. But such an interesting guy, and yeah, and he didn't die by falling off, which is actually really impressive. Maybe he's a patron of people with a fear of heights. Yeah, tree houses. That's right. Yeah, patron saint of tree. Yes. I don't know. I'll have to look that up for next time. But anyway, so that's that's good. Anything else? Awesome. Well, before we head off to church, let's bow our heads in prayer and close out today's session. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, again, I thank you for the witness of your saints. I thank you that we are surrounded by this great and wonderful and eclectic cloud of witnesses. All of these people who have sought to know you more and to help your people know you more. I pray that through their life and witness, our own faiths would be strengthened, that we would continue in our lives as they continued in theirs. For it's in your name that we pray. Amen.